You wind me up just like a clockwork orange. Vidi well, O my brothers, vidi well. Hi, welcome to Outlaw Bookseller. I'm Stephen E. Andrews, writer, collector, bookseller, general all-round good guy, or perhaps I should say today, general all-round Styliagi. Now, that's Russian, and I may be pronouncing it incorrectly, Styliagi. So if I'm wrong, please correct me if you know your Russian. And today I want to talk about something. I was in Bristol the other day with my friend Graham Bray, he of the stunning SF collection, 10,000 books, which you'll have seen on the channel, probably my most watched SF video. And we're planning a series soon, Two Grumpy Old Men Talk About SF, but that's coming up. But we were in Bristol together, saying we were sort of tootling around as you do on a Sunday, and we came across a bookstore near the river, and I bought this. Nothing special there, you might think. A Penguin A format copy of A Clockwork Orange with the classic David Pelham cover. Haven't you already got that, Steve? Of course I have. Here's my original one, which I bought back in 1981. It's spine faded. And, you know, this is one of my favourite novels of all time. It's one of my favourite science fiction novels of all time. I put it in a top 20 easily. And why did I pick up another copy? Well, the interesting thing is that there are two versions of the Clockwork Orange text. There is the British version, which was published by Heinemann. This is a Heinemann reprint from, let me see, there's the Heinemann colophon there, from 1989. This is the 7th printing. The book, of course, came out in 62 in the UK. And oh, look inside. I have a Clockwork Orange postcard. The French film poster, L'Orange Mécanique, and it's signed on the back by Anthony Burgess. Funnily enough, my hardcover copy is also signed by Anthony Burgess. Throughout this video, I'll be showing you other things which are signed by Anthony Burgess, all of them connected to Clockwork Orange. So yeah, so it's Heinemann 62 UK, and in America is W.W. Norton in 1963, which was the year I was born. And of course, Clockwork Orange is a novel about youth delinquency specifically, and it's a great book about being young generally, I think. I think the ideal time to read Clockwork is when you're in your teens, when, as I bought this in 81, so I was 18, which was kind of ideal, which is the age that Alex is at the end of the book, unless you've read the American text, which is missing the crucial 21st chapter. And today I'm going to talk about this textual variation. It's reasonably well known, but I do find a lot of people don't know about it, particularly in the UK. And it is interesting. So yeah, this is my 81, signed by Burgess, as I say, from the one time I met him, which was early 90s. What a great guy he was. This book, if you've not read it, is written in Nadsat, the teenage argot of that not too distant future. So let's sort of put a little bit more context around it. When and where is Clockwork Orange set? Well, Burgess himself said it's set in a near future welfare state. It has a Minister of the Interior, whereas in Britain we have a Home Office, though of course it could be a future Britain. The fact that there's lots of these sort of Russian words is interesting because Burgess had been to Leningrad shortly before this, and he'd encountered a gang of youths, and there were gangs in Russia between 1940 and the early 60s who were called Styliagi. And the Styliagi means sort of style-hungry style followers. It's a bit like the sort of cool hunters in the William Gibson Blue Ant trilogy, except, you know, these are active participants in a subculture. And they would sort of get clothes made. They'd make clothes at black markets and things. You couldn't buy clothes from the West. And to begin with, they were to jazz and swing, and later on rock and roll. And they tried to make their own recordings, and they would make them on old X-ray film plates. So you'd have an X-ray, and they would cut them because they couldn't get out of vinyl and stuff. And a lot of them went to prison for doing this. You know, it was not something you were supposed to do. And they had this sort of gang culture, and they were sort of more pro-capitalist and anti-communism, obviously, because they were rebels. But you see pictures of them, and they were mostly like sort of teddy boys, really. So they're still Yagi. There is a rumour that the band Zig Zig Sputnik from the 80s, who are formed by Tony James of Generation X, later the Sisters of Mercy, took the name Zig Zig Sputnik from a Russian street gang. Well, he didn't. Sputnik is obviously Russian. It means fellow traveller, and obviously it refers to the first satellite anybody ever sent into space. Well done, the Russians, on that. And you know, it's actually, Zig Zig Sputnik is actually a Filipino street gang, but Zig Zig Sputnik's first single, Love Missile F11, begins with a sample from the Clockwork Orange soundtrack. So that's probably where that came from. And there's lots of references to Clockwork in their videos and things. So there you go. So when Burgess was in Leningrad, he encountered the Stilyagi. His wife was reportedly raped by some GIs back in wartime, and he wanted to make comments about sort of youth delinquency and youth violence. We know it's set in the future because in a key scene at the beginning of the first chapter, when Alex and his gang, his droogs, his friends, droog obviously sounds like drug, Burgess said this himself and is spelt similarly as well. They beat up a tramp, and the tramp says, you know, it's a terrible world. There are men on the moon, and there are men whizzing around the earth. And of course, then nobody'd walked on the moon in 1962. It was 7 years later. So it's near future. It's a welfare state. It maybe is an Eastern European thing, but the whole thing about the Russian street slang, obviously it comes from the Stilyagi, which is the obvious inspiration, but Burgess' interesting language. And, you know, things get picked up on and trends come out of nowhere, like at the moment, everybody's very interested in Korean street style and what have you. So maybe that was the thing. He was a passion of my youth because I read Clockwork because it was a really famous book. There had been the Stanley Kubrick film, and I'm representing that here with two versions of the soundtrack on vinyl, both of which are signed by Anthony Burgess. That's Walter Carlos's full sort of score on the Moog synth, which wasn't all in the film, and this is the more sort of common version everybody will know, signed by Anthony Burgess. And there we are with the iconic artwork, and wonderful film, of course, one of the best science fiction films of all time, and obviously a very controversial film. And for many years people thought it was banned. It wasn't banned. Kubrick withdrew it from the British market because of threats to his family about the film, and he lived in Britain, of course. And I once sold an audiobook of Ursula Le Guin's Wizard of Earthsea to his wife, and it was an audiobook read by Le Guin herself and Harlan Ellison, interestingly enough. We didn't meet, it was done over the internet, but it's a very nice exchange, so there you go. As I say, people think the film was banned, it was withdrawn. So if you wanted to see it, you had to go to France. There was a cinema in Paris that used to show it constantly for years and years and years. And shortly after I read the novel, which I loved, I managed to acquire a couple of years later a bootleg cassette of it, a VHS, because it wasn't available. You couldn't see it in any form. It was never shown in British cinemas either. The Scala, I think, showed it once or twice after it was withdrawn. And then eventually, of course, it became released on home video, DVD, Blu-ray. I've seen it in the cinema. I saw it in the cinema about 20 years ago, a reissue. It was one of those things that you couldn't see because it was about teen gang violence, and of course that was deemed to be influential and dangerous. And there were lots of stories about sort of people being attacked and what have you. And it was mostly the tabloids trumping things up. But the real point of this video is to talk about the textual variations. So if you look at these two from the exterior, they're the same. Now, what's interesting is that this one here, which I bought in Bristol, the text in this reproduces the text in the W.W. Norton edition, even though this is a British penguin. And this British penguin is dated from, let me see, 1974. This is a third reprint from 74. So this sort of film came out a few years before that. I think the film was 71. And basically what this omits is the 21st chapter. It also has a glossary of Nadsat, the teenage argot of the not too distant future of Clockwork Orange. And argot is a slang, and we'll come into that a bit later on. So for a while, this version, the American text, was available in the UK, which baffles me because the film was based on the American text and missed the final chapter. So if you've only seen the film or read the American edition, you haven't encountered the whole thing. And it's very, very important. Now, why were the texts different on different sides of the Atlantic? Now, at the time, Burgess thought he was dying. He wrote about 5 novels in a year. He'd been misdiagnosed by a doctor as having a brain tumour, so he popped off 5 novels in a year. And he wanted to try and get some money to help support his wife after he died. And as it was, he didn't die. He didn't have a brain tumour, which was great because he wrote loads of great books, and I've read at least 30 books by him. I was a huge Burgessophile back in, you know, these sort of early 80s. So it's 40 years ago I got into him, you know, and I was a huge fan, and as I say, met him once. So W.W. Norton wanted to issue the book without the 21st chapter. Burgess himself had mixed feelings about whether the book should end with the 20th or 21st chapter. And the reasoning behind this was that the 21st chapter is important. Now, if you haven't read Clockwork Orange, this is a spoiler, so move it on about half a minute. What happens in the UK text from Heinemann and this penguin, I say, which is an 80s one, is that Alex grows up. 21 is symbolic. It used to be when you had the key of the door, when you came of age. That changed to 18 later on. But until a certain time, really until the end of the 60s, early 70s, 21 was regarded as the age of majority. So 21 was symbolic of growing up and becoming an adult. In the 21st chapter, Alex decides to step back from his former life of crime and villainy, and he decides he wants to settle down. He meets Pete, his old mate, his old droogie, from the original gang from early in the novel, and he just realizes that the time has come and he wants to settle down and grow up, and he can see himself growing old. He meditates on the idea that youth is rather being like a piece of clockwork, that you're not in control, your emotions, everything is sort of boiling up, the hormones, what have you, to go through puberty, and you're like a machine, and that basically, young people will make the same mistakes we've all made in youth time and time again until the end of time, and that's the way it will always be as long as we're human. And an important point about the book is about humanity and the freedom of choice. But the Norton edition omits this idea and ends with Alex being cured of the Ludovico technique. In the same way that the film ends, I was cured all right. And basically, the thought was at Norton's editorial was that this was more realistic. Why would Alex reform after going through everything, still being incorrigible, only succumbing to the choices that the Ludovico technique impose upon him? Because if he doesn't be a good guy, then he's sick because he's been conditioned by the drugs, the electroshock, and the other science fiction techniques which have been applied to him while he's in captivity to make him into a good guy. And the whole question in Clockwork Orange is it's all about free will. It's all about the concept that if God gives man free will, then he must be free to choose. Because if he makes the choice through self-interest, through not wanting to be sick, then it's not a sincere choice. It's not a decision to be good. It's a self-preservation choice. And obviously Burgess was a Catholic, and this is an important thing, because of course the big question in sort of Christianity to me is that if God gave us free will, then he dangles eternal life and heaven before us. So, that's a self-interested thing. So it's not really freedom of choice. It's that sort of illusory freedom of choice. So it's a big, wide issue. And that's what it's about. And Alex himself discusses this in the book as it's a first-person narrative. So, it's very important stuff. So that's the fundamental message. So Alex reaches a point where he has grown up. He is 18 in the 21st chapter, which is to say is symbolic. And he sees Pete and talks to him. He's settled down and he decides that, it's time to move on. And, and lots of people we know. Think of the people we've known in our own lives who are tearaways when they're young, and they settle down and they have children and they have families and they are respectable and they play their part. Some of them don't, tragically, and they usually come to a sticky end. And some of them do, and they move on. It's just one of those things. We all make mistakes in our youth. We have to be forgiving of that. So that's the thing. So the two things, and Burgess and Kubrick as well, when he came to make the film. Kubrick had an American copy, but he also had a British copy, and he was divided about what to do. And he decided to go with the American sort of variant. And obviously Warner Brothers, American film company, the film would probably gross more in America. So possibly those are decisions as well. So if you can find a copy with the missing 21st chapter, is quite interesting, but it's not definitive. All the UK editions for years and years and years have been the definitive edition. So this is quite uncommon now. I had seen one before. My friend John, hi John, who's over in Colorado. We were big fans of Clockwork when we were kids. Well, we were Malchicks, I should say. He had a copy of this, and I've never owned one. I've been looking through it, because what's interesting to me is that the glossary of Nadsat language, which is in the American variant text, is obviously not put together by Burgess. And a big thing in this is the fact that the argot of A Clockwork Orange is basically a lot of Russian there's also lots of other things in there, because Burgess is a real polyglot. He was fascinated by language, and the glossary is actually pretty inaccurate, and it sort of says any words which are not sort of Russian or from a Russian root, they've marked with an asterisk. And there's things like Roz for Rosa, policeman, and that is a Cockney usage from the 19th century, the Rosas, so it's one of those things. But it does get you looking at the language. But the Nadsat glossary, you don't really need it. So if you've only got this from the glossary, throw it away. When I first read Clockwork Orange, I found it very easy to read, and the secret to it is read the first chapter. So if you're young and you've never read this, or you've never read it and you're older like me, you've got a treat ahead of you, because it's a brilliant novel, very fleet, short, fabula, fantastic SF, very muscular, funny, dark, violent, great characterization, very witty, and it's a book with every human emotion in it, really, pretty much. And fundamentally, what I did was I read the first chapter, and then I went back to the beginning and read it again. And basically you can work out what is being said by the tense and the sentences themselves. So for example, the second line, there was me, that is Alex, and my three droogs, that is Pete, Georgie and Dim being really dim, and we sat in the Korova milk bar making up our rasudoks what to do in the evening. So you've got some unfamiliar, what's a rasudok? Making up our rasudoks, making up our minds what to do in the evening. So it's not difficult, you can work it out. There's a couple of odd things, but through reading and rereading, you get to discover what it all means. And it's wonderful. It's this marvelous, marvelous book. It's not a book for somebody who struggles with reading. If you do read it, it sort of improves your sort of facility with language and understanding of grammar enormously. And it's great fun. I put it up there with the greatest of dystopias, up there with 1984 and We and all those things, and I think it's magnificent. So that's why there's two variations of the text. Obviously the influence of A Clockwork Orange and youth culture used to be absolutely enormous, and it was huge throughout the 70s and early 80s. When I first got into this, I used to wear white jeans, a white collarless shirt, braces. I didn't do the bowler hat thing, but I pretty much did everything else, and I had a cane as well. And of course, I wasn't a violent type. It could have got me into trouble. What was interesting was all the sort of roughnecks where I came from wanted to sort of borrow my Clockwork Orange t-shirt. They wanted to buy it off me. They wanted to borrow my VHS and stuff. And and these are guys who tried to beat me up before, probably, and and they got quite chummy with me as a result. And by then I could brazen it out. You know how it is as you get older and you start to bluff things quite well. So it was really important. There were bands like Heaven 17, take the name from a fictional band in the book, and it's interesting. When Alex mentions the sort of pop acts which are big at the time, because he likes classical music, he mentions Goggly Gogol, and of course Gogol was a great Russian novelist who threw his most famous novel Dead Souls on the fire, and his wife pulled it off, otherwise we'd never had it. And he mentions Johnny Zhivago, which is a reference to Boris Pasternak's novel Dr. Zhivago. So all the literary stuff really comes through in this, and the musical stuff, because Burgess was a composer as well. So the things were really influential, and the soundtrack album was bought by loads of people in the glam and sort of punk periods, and Bowie, for example, in Suffragette City was saying, "Hey Droogie, don't crash here." And there are references to sort of the language and style of Clockwork Orange throughout popular culture in the 70s and early 80s. It was a really big thing. Interestingly, at the beginning, when the Droogs are in the Korova milk bar, and Korova was a record label later on. It was the record label Echo and the Bunnymen were on, and they did songs like The Cutter and Do It Clean, which clearly have Clockwork Orange references as well. The Korova milk bar that sells milk plus something else, and the plus things are drugs. So the drugs are legalized in this near future welfare state, which is nonetheless riven with crime. There's no talk of drug dealing, which is interesting. There's lots of violence and there's political things, but there isn't any drug dealing. So that is quite an interesting thing. But the drugs which are mentioned, there's one called Velocet, which obviously velocity, speed, amphetamines. There's one called Synthamesc, synthetic mescaline, and that's borne out by a comment in the text where Alex considers giving Dim some Synthamesc so that he sort of burbles off into a psychedelic trance, and is in such a pain. And there's also Drenchrome is mentioned. Now, Drenchrome, of course, means adrenochrome. Adrenochrome is a chemical that's found only in your adrenal gland, and it can act as a drug. And if you read Hunter S. Thompson's Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, which is a piece of journalism from the 1960s, Hunter Thompson, famous school of gonzo journalism, he writes in there about wanting to take adrenochrome, and you can only get it from a human adrenal gland, so this is very, very dangerous and totally illegal. So drenchrome is clearly a synthetic kind of adrenochrome, and there's a Sisters of Mercy song called adrenochrome as well, which leads us back to Zig Zig Sputnik. So you see the influences there. But anyway, the important thing is that there are two editions. If you come across on the NADSAT glossary, the glossary is not very good. I'm not certain if the American one is still only 20 chapters, but if it is, get the British one with 21, because that's the way it was meant to be. So, a little chat on Clockwork Orange. There's a heck of a lot we could say about it. It's a brilliant novel. It's an amazing film. The soundtrack's hugely influential over me. I love synth music. I used to play synth myself. And, you know, it's one of those things, you know, it should be as famous as 1984. It is famous. It should be more famous. I do sell a Clockwork Orange a lot in work. I don't see it discussed that much in science fiction things on YouTube, but I absolutely love it. So if you haven't read A Clockwork Orange, you really need to seep into it. It's vitally important. It's one of the most important science fiction novels ever written. It's questions about free will, and it's great looking in the near future, and how language is important. And that ties as well to 1984, because it's the use of language in the future. And in Clockwork Orange, it shows how language can be actually broader and magnificent. And there's a superb subplot in here, of course, about the writer, Mr. Alexander, who's written a book called A Clockwork Orange, which is very meta as well. And that's all about free will and mechanization and what have you. So it's great stuff. And just to finish off, A Clockwork Orange, what does it mean? Well, orange is from the Malay root, orang, man, orangutan. And Burgess was in the army in Malaya, and his first three novels, the Malayan trilogy, also known as The Long Day Wanes, are set out there. So it's a clockwork man. And there is this theory that it's a Cockney expression, maybe it was, but A Clockwork Orange is a clockwork man. And there you go. So why didn't he call it Clockwork Man? But that's Burgess' view. He wanted you to look at language. He was a Joycean. He loved it. So for those of you who really love well-written SF, this is the business. Two different texts, and that's why they're there. This is Outlaw Bookseller, signing off for now. I'm so enthusiastic about this. I really want you to read it. I'm sure you probably have, and I could talk about it for hours. So yeah, you know, how to finish a video when it's a book this great. It's just a masterpiece. This is Outlaw Bookseller, signing out. Bye for now.